You're recognized as Representative Gay-Dagnogo to speak to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak to this amendment for Senate Bill 111 to talk about the impact that economic development is having, both the benefit and some of the downside to communities, urban communities. Recently, we had an article that was written that talked about the tale of two cities in the city of Detroit. I believe that was authored by Nolan Finley. Talked about the way that big developers view this economic boom and how residents, how seniors, how those who are dependent upon low and affordable housing see these developments. Just recently talked to a family in the Brightmoor community. No, it's not downtown, but it's someone who I also sat down with, a former member who is now the director of MISHDA, talking about how this family, who was doing everything right, who rented this property in Brightmoor community, the Clark family, who has a daughter who actually went to Washington, D.C. and spoke to issues impacting schools in their neighborhood. But this family, a father and a mother, raising their children, bought into a home when they thought that they actually were buying, but they were actually renting. And after the 15 years of the incentive that was provided, they were nowhere in sight able to purchase this property. I've received calls from seniors downtown Detroit, not in my district, but they see me as visible and they say, hey, we've been pushed out of our property. The rent has increased. I received a press release from the mayor today talking about the partnership of labor. And yes, I strongly support labor, but I'm continuing to hear from residents who are challenged and perplexed on how they will have an opportunity to live in these big developments. And so my amendment is seeking to create an opportunity that will be in compliance with the City of Detroit's housing ordinance that calls for 20% or more of these residents to be low and affordable housing. We know the benefit, yes, from big million-dollar corporations and those who are coming to bring their resources, their money to the city, and redeveloping these brownfield properties that wouldn't ordinarily be utilized. But we also know the cries that are coming from those who might not one day be able to live in them. I've had the benefit of working downtown, working as a staffer before in Detroit City Council, and I knew a much different downtown. I remember the late Martha Jean the Queen talking about the development of the Kern block and her vision of seeing that area redevelop. And so now we see it. It's taken place. My amendment is just seeking an opportunity for those residents who depend on affordable housing to have an opportunity to be a part of this economic boom in our city. For the least of these to be considered, to have a housing opportunity, to live and play in the areas where we see this economic boom. So I'm asking for these brownfield developments to incorporate a component that will be in compliance for low and affordable housing for low-income families. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Representative Gay-Dagnogo. The question for the House is the adoption of the amendment. Clerk will open the board. The amendment is not adopted. Are there further amendments? There are further amendments. The clerk will read.
Representative Gay-Dagnogo offers one amendment identified as Amendment 1G.
Chair recognizes Representative Gay-Dagnogo to speak to the amendment.
Thank you so much. I come before you again, Mr. Speaker, to talk about economic development and the role that minority and women business contractors play in the field of economic development. We know that in the state of Michigan, women are disproportionately represented in the skilled trades. We're disproportionately represented in the industry of business. A lot of decisions are made that rely on the support of women, but far too often there is a huge gap in the ability to really participate and to really be considered a true, a viable component of business development. As 20% or a little bit more represented in the House, I think that it is incumbent upon all of us as women to realize that we should be considered contractors, that we should be valued as business owners, and that we should have a leading role in the economic boom of any business taking place in the state of Michigan that incorporates Michigan tax dollars. So I ask my colleagues to support in this amendment to advance minorities and women-owned business in this legislation.
Thank you, Representative Gay-Dagnogo. The question for the House is the adoption of the amendment. Clerk will open the board. The amendment is not adopted. Are there further amendments? There are further amendments. Clerk will read.
Representative Gay-Dagnogo offers one amendment identified as Amendment 1H.
Chair recognizes Representative Gay-Dagnogo to speak to the amendment.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. Thank you again for all of the aforementioned reasons that I've outlined with this legislation. Once again, those occupants that will become business owners within these facilities that are using state of Michigan tax dollars. I believe that it is important from a city, especially predominantly African-American city, that minorities be given an opportunity to have 50% or more involvement in those businesses that will develop within the properties that are outlined by this legislation. Additionally, women-owned businesses with one or more women leading the business and the entity, either retail or otherwise, should have an opportunity to be considered and have place as an occupant for this legislation. So I'm asking my colleagues to support women advancing and minorities advancing as occupants in this business development.
Thank you, Representative Gay-Dagnogo. The question is the adoption of the amendment. Clerk will open the board. The amendment is not adopted.